In April 1943, a plane named the Lady Be Good flew across Libya on a military mission to Naples, Italy. Later that evening, communication was unexpectedly cut off, and the location of the jet and its crew remained unknown for nearly 2 decades. When it was ultimately revealed what had transpired, it was far more horrific than anyone could have predicted. This is the mysterious disappearance of Lady Be Good. On April 4th, 1943, the world was in the thick of World War II, which was still more than 2 years from ending. On a little airport called Salak near Benghazi, Libya, pilot William Hatton sat in a brand new jet, prepared to take off for its first flight with a crew of 9. Williams' B-24D Liberator was one of 28 U.S. aircraft launched on a bombing mission over Naples, Italy that day. Williams' plane was assigned to the second wave in a 2-wave attack, therefore it was one of the last to take off from Salus that day. The mission instructions were simple: take off, establish a formation with the planes ahead of them, and attack strategic points in the Italian harbor to prevent supplies and reinforcements from reaching Naples. North Africa was a vital theater for both Allied and Axis forces during World War II, yet it is rarely discussed. Fighting in the region began in June 1940 and lasted until 1943, with about 400,000 losses on both sides of the conflict. Because of its physical location, the Allies needed to control access to, from, and over the Mediterranean Sea. Countries such as Libya, Algeria, and Egypt were ideal for commencing aviation attacks to prevent Axis powers from consolidating in the Mediterranean. In reality, had the Allies not gained control of North Africa, the pivotal invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, which resulted in the demise of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, could never have occurred. Now, the U.S. military's preferred instrument for aerial attacks was the plane William was flying, a heavy bomber with an extremely long flight range and the capacity to cruise at high speeds. The Liberator was such a popular plane that it remains the most produced bomber in American military aviation history, at least among the generals. This is likely due to its ability to fly long distances on a single tank of fuel while carrying a high bomb load. Airmen, on the other hand, preferred the more spacious B-17S since the B-24 had lower ceilings and far less free space. This, however, contributes to the aircraft's efficiency. Compared to others, it also had what is known as the Davis wing, which produced far less drag. The Davis wing was no longer used after World Conflict II, but it did help make the Liberator the preferred aircraft of the U.S. military throughout the conflict. As superb as the B-24 was, the weather on April 4th didn't cooperate enough to make the trip to Naples routine. Salak was prone to sandstorms due to its proximity to the Libyan coast and high winds. The amount of sand in the air hindered visibility significantly. After the initial wave of B-24's Ds took off, several of its pilots deemed it risky to continue flying. As those planes turned around to return to Salak, Williams' plane, called the Lady Be Good, took to the sky for the first time and began its journey to Italy. As the plane approached the formation's projected location, William heard pilot after pilot report on the radio that they were returning to Salak due to poor weather conditions that compromised the aircraft's functionality. This is because sandstorms pose a unique threat to aircraft. Because sand is gritty and rough, it may be abrasive and damage everything from windshields to engines. However, William believed the Lady Be Good was holding up well despite the weather, so he and the crew continued alone. Then, barely 30 minutes from Naples, he noticed a problem with the engines and realized it was due to the sand. William, like the other 27 members of the mission, chose to turn the jet around and return to Salak. Almost as soon as the Lady Be Good was headed south, her automatic direction finder ceased working. This faulty piece of equipment is crucial for aircraft navigation since it constantly displays the plane's heading. Ironically, the problem was not caused by the sandstorm, yet it was still a huge concern. Salak, located almost 700 miles, 1,100 kilometers southeast of Naples, would be nearly impossible to discover if William didn't know which way the jet was pointing. In ideal conditions, the crew would navigate by sight using ground markers, but this was impossible during a sandstorm in and around Libya. Because Salak was located in the northern part of the country, the Libyan shoreline with the Mediterranean Sea would have been the finest landmark the men could have asked for, as cities are scarce in the area. Indeed, the enormous, desolate Sahara Desert dominates the region. Therefore, there are few permanent towns and settlements even today. It is unclear why officials and radio operators made the judgments they did that night, but in either case, the jet would not get navigational assistance. And shortly, not only was a sandstorm still generating vision issues in the area, but night had fallen, making flying by sight even more challenging. In the end, the Lady Be Good did not reach Solok that night. And when the crew stopped responding to radio operators, U.S. military leaders in North Africa were concerned. Early the next day, a search and rescue attempt was initiated, but no one knew where to seek because the plane's last known location was over the Mediterranean. This is when the automatic directional finder ceased operating. Finally, when it became evident that the plane and its crew were unlikely to be discovered, the U.S. military stated that it was acting under the assumption that the Lady Be Good had crashed in the Mediterranean Sea and that all 9 men on board were presumed dead. With that, the military deemed the case concluded. By 1958, the world's rising reliance on fossil fuels had sparked a race among oil firms to find new and more profitable drilling locations. North Africa just happened to have a lot of them. During a scouting flight over Libya, 6 British geologists working for an oil business were looking out their windows for signs of oil when one of them noticed a debris field below. This was then pointed out to the others, and the pilots circled the area at a low altitude to provide a better view of what it was. That didn't take long for them to realize that was the wreckage of an aircraft that had clearly crashed there. Because it seemed to be a military plane, the pilot informed Wheelus Air Force Base in Libya of the finding. But officials there showed little interest at first. They had no records of a lost jet. Therefore, the discovery was largely irrelevant to them. Over the next few months, geologists conducted increasingly extensive investigations of the area, one of whom happened to be a close friend of the commander at the same airbase. After viewing the crash site from the ground one of these times, the geologist submitted a letter to the commander, detailing everything he saw, including maintenance records and crew names discovered on clothing remaining inside the plane. Then, while cross-checking the identities, Wheelus executives discovered the significance of the discovery. A military investigative team was dispatched to the crash site coordinates in May 1959, 6 months after the crashed jet was first reported, and it was undoubtedly the Lady Be Good. Many years before, when William requested assistance from Solok that night in 1943, radio operators made a critical error. Rather than giving verbal instructions from the start, Solok officials opted to discharge a succession of flares into the sandstorm, hoping that the Lady Be Good would notice them. The plane clearly couldn't see the flares, despite its best intentions. William then unknowingly flew directly past the airstrip and headed south. Communication between the crew and the ground was maintained for 2 hours after the plane overshot the runway, after officials determined firing flares might not be the best choice. Verbal guidance then began in the hopes of bringing the jet down, but it was too late. The plane had been flying in an unknown direction for far too long, and nobody on the ground or in the air knew where it was. The plane's radio abruptly remained silent, and all attempts to re-establish contact failed. The best guess was that the jet and its crew were lost in the Mediterranean Sea. In truth, the Lady Be Good overshot Solok by 440 miles to the south, and the military was correct that the jet crashed in the water, but not in the Mediterranean. Instead, the plane slid to a halt in the center of the Calancio Sand Sea. This area covers an incredible 24,000 square miles, 62,000 square kilometers of parched, unforgiving terrain. There is little water, no foliage, no shade, and very little edible fauna. When the investigating team arrived several years later and began a comprehensive search of the crash site, they discovered a strange lack of human remains and activity. Surprisingly, the plane itself was in relatively fair condition. Further investigation found that it crashed in the desert without a drop of fuel in its tanks. 3 of the 4 propellers were rippled, indicating that they were not working at the moment of contact, and there was no evidence of an explosion or fire, implying that it was fully survivable. The crewmen, on the other hand, were not on board when the plane crashed, as proven by the lack of parachutes in the Lady Be Good. It was eventually realized that they must have bailed from the plane before it crashed, and they could have been anywhere at the time. The investigation team then broadened its search beyond the crash site. The first evidence of the crew was discovered some 19 miles, 31 kilometers, north. Half-buried parachutes and a pair of rubber flight boots with toes making an arrow pointing north were lying in the desert. Despite having some idea of where the crew of the Lady Be Good might have gone, nothing more was discovered during the initial search. For 3 months following, investigators searched for the men's corpses until desert sand caused their cars and other equipment to fail. Just like in 1943, the The U.S. military closed the case on the Lady Be Good, assuming the 9 men's bodies had been buried in the sand after 15 years of exposure to desert conditions. 6 months after the search was called off, oil firm employees made another unexpected find while on a scouting flight. 5 human bodies, all dressed in military uniforms, were found scattered around a short area. Shortly after, it was revealed that the names on those uniforms matched those of the crewmen aboard the Lady Be Good during her maiden and final flights. Military personnel then returned to the Libyan desert to investigate and recover the fallen airmen. Among the objects discovered with the 5 dead were flashlights, flight jackets, and shreds of parachute material. But the diary of Second Lieutenant and co-pilot Robert Toner provided a more comprehensive account of what occurred. Between April 5th and April 9th, 1943, Robert wrote daily entries in his journal, telling a horrifying account of the virtually impossible. The following is what may be gleaned from the journal entries. After getting lost on the trip back to Salish, the Lady Be Good was running dangerously low on gasoline, causing the men to jump out of the plane just before it crashed into the ground. They finally touched down at 2 a.m., and the crewmen began to gather, but just 8 of them showed up. The men discovered that Second Lieutenant John Waravka had gone missing, but it was too dark to investigate. When the sun came up on April 5th, the 8 crewmen searched for John, but there was no sign of him. If they were to survive, they would have to begin moving without him. The soldiers then set off on foot towards the northwest. Although Robert did not explain why William took that route, it is possible that he was aware that he had overshot Suluk and felt the airfield was much closer than it was. In any case, when the guys left on April 5th, they only had the clothing on their backs, a few food rations, and a single canteen that was only halfway full. That was the only water they had. Thankfully, their first day in the desert was fairly calm, with even a breeze. But once the sun went down that night, the Lady Be Good crew's ordeal had only begun. No one could sleep that night due to near-freezing temperatures after the sun went down, which may seem paradoxical given the circumstances. However, the desert is known to get rather cold at night. Sand is not a good insulator, thus it does not hold heat well. Deserts are also extremely dry, and because there is almost no moisture in the air, sand cools at night as quickly as it heats during the day. To fight the freezing temperatures, the guys agreed to keep going at night and rest during the worst portions of the day when temperatures reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 54 degrees Celsius. The 8 crewmen stopped to rest around 11:30 a.m. the next day and did not resume their journey until 5 p.m. During that period, they became acutely aware of the danger they were in. The breeze was gone, and the sun was merciless. As Robert relates in his journal, they were essentially in hell. As the sun fell, the men spent the night walking in 15-minute intervals, then resting for 5 minutes until the sun rose on April 7th. By then, the lack of food, water, and sleep had taken its toll on them, and none of them could travel very far without stopping to rest. They began praying more than walking, and it was at this point that they recognized they were unlikely to survive the desert. Despite this knowledge, the men carried on. The next day, they came to an area of high sand dunes that they needed to climb to continue their journey. The wind had also returned, which was a nice change in temperature, but it was also strong enough to blow sand around, causing all of the men to have eye problems. This was so terrible that one of them temporarily lost total vision. Then, a few days later, on April 9th, the ordeal would finally come to an end for some of them. 5 of them, including William and Robert, were unable to continue because of the ordeal they had been through. One of the final things Robert wrote in his journal as he lay in the sand was that they were all exhausted and simply wanted it to end. Unfortunately, they would all receive their wish shortly after the final journal post. Following the discovery of the dead in 1960, there was one final coordinated search for the other members of the Lady Be Good crew. Operation Climax featured 6 desert vehicles, 2 helicopters, and 19 troops and airmen. Now that at least some of the crewmen had been discovered, officials could focus on a much narrower region. By May 12th, this method had paid off, with Guy's body discovered 21 miles north of the 5 bodies. 5 days later, rescuers discovered Harold's remains another 5 miles northwest of Guy, in an area of sand dunes 600 feet, 183 meters. When Operation Climax officially ended, just 2 men remained missing, John and Vernon. In August 1960, oil company employees discovered another body, as they had done twice previously. If you recall, John was the only crew member who never linked up with the rest of the men after they escaped from the Lady Be Good. He was discovered 12 miles north of the crash scene, and it was clear that John's parachute had never released properly. While the chute reduced his speed slightly, it was insufficient for him to survive the landing. Therefore, his remains were discovered still inside his flying suit, with the deployed and tangled parachute still connected to his back. Vernon's body was never found, despite a search area of 6,300 square miles, more than 16,000 square kilometers. Although the finding of the men largely answered the riddle, it also revealed even more tragic circumstances. If the 8 men had taken a different decision, they would most likely have survived the desert crash. When the crewmen gathered after jumping from the plane, they were approximately 19 miles north of the mostly intact Lady Be Good. The plane was in excellent shape compared to most disasters, and what investigators discovered inside was tragic. It contained days' worth of ready-to-eat meals, water canteens, and even a thermos full of coffee that remained drinkable more than 15 years after the plane crashed. Even the machine gun was still operational, and that wasn't all. After all those years in the desert, there were still enough resources to rescue the 8 surviving crewmen, and all they needed to do to survive was trek south rather than northwest. Obviously, this does not diminish the men's brave efforts and seemingly superhuman resolve to survive. The men walked an astonishing 85 miles, 137 kilometers, from their rendezvous point in the desert to where the 5 dead were discovered, with only half a canteen of water between them. Even more incredible, Guy walked another 21 miles, bringing his total to 106, while Rip made it another 5 before succumbing to the elements. Sadly, despite the tremendous lengths they had traveled, they were still far from civilization. The sole search made while the guys were still alive was over the Mediterranean Sea, which they were unaware of at the time. Robert even mentioned in his diary that the troops didn't see a single plane overhead to signal to. This lack of search activity must have highlighted their need to save themselves, and they undoubtedly made an admirable effort. Desert specialists were astounded when they learned what the soldiers had accomplished. In any case, with the mystery of the Lady Be Good's disappearance finally explained, a final investigation was conducted to uncover the cause, allowing the military to learn from its blunders and oversights. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and thanks again for viewing, and I hope to see you in the next one.